On the island of Okinawa, in the southernmost prefecture of Japan, there are more people over the age of 100 per capita than almost anywhere else on Earth. They tend not to live in care facilities. They tend not to spend their final decades in managed decline. They garden, they cook, they gather with neighbors in the early evening. They have opinions about things. They argue, occasionally, about small matters. And then they go to sleep and wake up and do it again. For decades, researchers have been traveling to Okinawa and to other parts of Japan trying to understand what, precisely, is happening. The answers they have returned with are both simpler and more unsettling than the ones most people were hoping to find. There is no single supplement. There is no particular exercise regime. There is, instead, something that looks very much like a way of being in the world. A set of habits and values and relationships so thoroughly integrated into daily life that the people living them do not experience them as health practices at all. They experience them as simply how one lives. The most discussed of these concepts is ikigai. The word is often translated as reason for getting up in the morning, though this loses something in the transfer. It is closer to the sense of a life that has a direction, not necessarily a grand purpose or a dramatic calling, but a thread. Something that connects who you are to what you do to who depends on you. In 2025, ikigai has become something of a global export, reproduced in diagrams, sold as a framework, applied to career planning and wellness retreats. This is not entirely what it means in the places where it was never a concept at all, simply a condition of how life was arranged. In the village communities of Okinawa and across rural Japan more broadly, the structure of daily life has historically made ikigai difficult to avoid. Work was tied to place. Place was tied to people. People were tied, through obligation and genuine affection and long memory, to one another. The question of why one got up in the morning was answered before it could be asked. Equally important is the concept of moai, the small, stable social group that forms in childhood and, in traditional Okinawan culture, remains more or less intact across a lifetime. 5 or 6 people who commit formally to being available to one another. Financially, emotionally, practically. The group meets regularly. It functions as a social safety net, a source of accountability, and, research now suggests, one of the more reliable predictors of longevity that demographers have been able to identify. The Harvard Study of Adult Development, the longest-running study of human happiness ever conducted, arrived at a similar conclusion by a different route. The quality of our close relationships predicts health outcomes in old age more accurately than cholesterol levels, exercise habits, or socioeconomic status. Then there is Hara Hachi Bu, the practice, embedded in Confucian teaching and in the daily habits of Okinawan communities for centuries, of stopping eating at roughly 80% full, not as a diet, not as an act of discipline or denial, as a cultural norm so thoroughly internalized that it requires no particular willpower to maintain, in the same way that most people do not require willpower to stop eating before the point of physical pain. The body, consulted slightly earlier in the process, turns out to have a great deal of useful information to offer. What all of these practices share, and what the researchers who study them have slowly come to recognize, is that none of them are individual. They are not things a person does alone through private resolution and personal effort. They are things that happen between people, within structures, inside communities that have quietly organized themselves around conditions favorable to human flourishing. This is the finding that tends to sit most uneasily with contemporary Western audiences, because it implies that the problem cannot be solved by the individual alone, however motivated or informed. In much of the modern world, and particularly in the most economically developed parts of it, the conditions that Okinawa preserved more or less intact have been systematically dismantled. Work is no longer tied to place. Communities are no longer stable. The small group of people who have known you since childhood and will notice specifically and promptly when something is wrong. For most people reading this, that group does not exist. The meal eaten in the company of others, without a screen, at a table, at a regular hour, has become something that requires effort and planning, rather than something that simply happens. The Japanese secret to living a long life is, in this sense, not a secret at all. It is something older than medicine, older than wellness as an industry, older than the language we now use to discuss these things. It is the observation, ancient and stubbornly recurring, that human beings kept in contact with purpose, with one another, and with the rhythms of a life that has some structure to it, tend to survive. And more than that, tend to remain, in the truest sense, alive. What Okinawa asks of us, looked at honestly, is not to adopt its specific practices, though some of them translate reasonably well. It asks something harder. It asks us to examine the degree to which the societies we have built, efficient, convenient, optimized for individual productivity and consumption, have quietly removed the conditions under which people have always, in every culture that has produced significant longevity, managed to thrive. The answer to that examination is not comfortable, but it may be the only one that is actually useful.